Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Iran and the Middle East in the past 24 hours. We are diving straight into the big one. The US and Iran are edging toward a possible ceasefire framework that could reopen the Strait of Hormuz, calm global energy markets, and maybe, big maybe, create a path back into nuclear negotiations. But let's be very clear from the jump. This is not a finished peace deal. This is a pressure valve, and everybody involved is already trying to define what that valve actually controls. The emerging framework would reportedly extend the ceasefire for 60 days, reopen and demine the Strait of Hormuz, and start a follow-on process over Iran's nuclear program. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking in New Delhi, said there is a pretty solid thing on the table for reopening the strait and moving into serious, time-limited talks on enrichment and Iran's highly enriched uranium. President Trump, meanwhile, is doing the classic yes, but not so fast routine. He says the deal is not fully negotiated, that negotiators should not rush, and that the U.S. blockade stays in place until an agreement is reached, certified, and signed. That matters because the U.S. and Iran are not describing the same deal in the same way. Washington is presenting this as a staged process. Reopen Hormuz first, then use the next 60 days to force meaningful nuclear commitments. Tehran is describing it more like this: end the war first, relieve pressure first, reopen the strait under Iranian-managed terms, and talk nuclear later. That is a massive gap, not a paperwork gap, a strategic canyon with a gift shop. The Strait of Hormuz is the prize on the table. Iran has effectively turned the waterway into leverage over global oil, Gulf security, and Washington's patience. The draft reportedly requires Iran to restore traffic to pre-war levels within 30 days. In return, the U.S. would loosen or lift its naval blockade as implementation proceeds. Markets loved the sound of that. Brent crude dropped roughly 5% to around $98 a barrel, and Asian markets moved up. That is the global economy hearing someone whisper, maybe the oil spigot is not on fire anymore. But Iran is not messaging this as a full retreat. IRGC-linked outlets are saying Iran will still control routes, timing, permits, and coordination through the strait. The IRGC Navy even claimed 33 ships passed through in 24 hours after receiving Iranian permission. So Washington is saying, open strait. Tehran is saying, open, but check with us first. Those are two very different strategic outcomes. The nuclear file is where things get really slippery. U.S. officials say Iran would commit to disposing of its highly enriched uranium stockpile, what Trump and Rubio have been calling the nuclear dust. Iranian sources are pushing back, saying the preliminary memorandum does not include a nuclear agreement, and that Tehran has not agreed to hand over its highly enriched uranium. Rubio's line was that you cannot do a nuclear deal in 72 hours on the back of a napkin. True. But critics are asking the obvious follow-up. Once Hormuz reopens and Iran gets breathing room, how much leverage does Washington still have? Iran appears to believe it is negotiating from strength. Former IRGC commander Mohsen Rezaei claimed the U.S. is in a complete stalemate and warned that renewed war could start at Hormuz and spread to Bab el-Mandeb and the Indian Ocean. That is not subtle. That is Tehran saying, we have more switches we can flip. Gulf states want the shooting and energy disruption to stop? Absolutely. But they also do not want Iran walking away with a new informal veto over maritime commerce. That would be a pretty rough regional sequel, and nobody asked for Hormuz 2, Tollbooth Boogaloo. Israel is watching all this with visible discomfort. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he and Trump remain aligned on blocking an Iranian nuclear weapon. But Israeli analysts and officials are worried the framework may not deliver the war aims Israel set out at the beginning, dismantling the nuclear threat, curbing ballistic missile production, and limiting Iran's support to Hezbollah, Hamas, and other partners. The current outline appears heavily focused on Hormuz, ceasefire sequencing, and future nuclear talks. Missiles and proxies are much fuzzier. For Israel, that is the part of the script where the music gets ominous. Lebanon is the immediate stress test. Iran and Hezbollah want any ceasefire to apply on all fronts, including Lebanon. The U.S. and Israel want Israel to retain the right to act against imminent Hezbollah threats. Netanyahu told Trump that Israel must remain free to operate against threats in Lebanon, and an Israeli source said Trump backed that principle. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem welcomed the possibility of a U.S.-Iran agreement, but he also condemned direct talks between Lebanon and Israel, rejected calls for Hezbollah to disarm, and urged Lebanese citizens to take to the streets against their government. Rubio fired back, accusing Hezbollah of trying to drag Lebanon back into chaos. And the situation in Lebanon is still hot. Israeli strikes have continued across southern and eastern Lebanon despite ceasefire language, and Hezbollah has continued attacks against Israeli troops and northern Israel. The tactical details matter only because they expose the bigger problem. A ceasefire with a broad self-defense exception can become a ceasefire in name only. Israel sees that exception as survival. Iran and Hezbollah see it as a loophole big enough to drive the whole conflict through. Back in Washington, the domestic politics are getting spicy. Republican hawks, including Roger Wicker, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Tom Tillis, are questioning whether Trump is about to reward Iran for closing Hormuz. They worry Tehran could receive billions in relief, preserve nuclear options, and keep effective leverage over the strait. Trump is pushing back hard, saying any deal will be great and meaningful, or there will be no deal. Speaker Mike Johnson and Senator Rand Paul are giving him room, while Democrats are also criticizing the outline as potentially just a return to the pre-war status quo. When both hawks and Democrats are yelling at the same deal for different reasons, you know the policy kitchen is officially crowded. Gaza is another reminder that ceasefires can freeze conflicts in place rather than resolve them. Israel now controls roughly 59% of the enclave, up from 53% at the start of the October ceasefire. The yellow line separating Israeli and Hamas-controlled areas has moved deeper into Gaza, with trenches, berms, concrete markers, and new outposts hardening the division. Hamas is resisting disarmament and reportedly rebuilding parts of its military infrastructure. Israel is preparing options for renewed fighting after the Iran war ends. The result is a partition that keeps getting more real by the week. Inside Israel, President Isaac Herzog delivered an unusually sharp warning about what he called a process of brutalization in Israeli society. He pointed to extremist settler violence in the West Bank, abuse of detainees, and attacks against Christians and Muslims. Coming from a largely ceremonial president, that was not background noise. That was a flare. Israel is managing Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, domestic extremism, and international scrutiny all at once. That is a brutal stack of problems. One final intelligence thread deserves attention. ISW cited leaked documents indicating the IRGC Aerospace Force used a UAE-based company in late 2025 to acquire advanced Chinese satellite antenna equipment through Dubai's Jebel Ali port. That follows U.S. sanctions on Chinese companies accused of providing satellite imagery to Iran during the war. The lesson is simple. Even if diplomacy cools this crisis, Iran's procurement networks are still working. Chinese technology, Gulf commercial hubs, and IRGC front companies remain part of the machinery. Beijing may prefer to look like the quiet guy in the corner, but somehow its gear keeps showing up exactly where the world least needs it. Thanks for listening. If this was useful, a quick review or comment helps others find the show. For deeper coverage, check out our daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com. Have a great week.